Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Ryan Silverstein back to the program. Ryan, you've been a regular on here before. For those meeting you for the first time, take a moment. Tell us just a little bit about who you are.
I'm a JD candidate at Villanova University, and I'm also a fellow with Villanova's McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy.
Well, I'm looking at a piece you wrote for the New York Daily News about their partisan campaign finance cronyism. And I always assumed that political parties are going to be pretty self-serving, but good heavens. Yeah, when I read your article and I read about how basically one party has set up their campaign finance system in a way that purely benefits that party. Set the stage for us. Talk to me a little bit about what's New York campaign finance law like, and why does it tend to favor those who, well, let's say, want to benefit from it?
So New York Democrats, they came up with this great idea for matching funds for campaigns. Now, on face value, that's great, and I've actually seen it work in the past. But the way they set it up in New York is crazy, right? Basically, it's made to empower small dollar donors. So if I make a donation of $250 or less, it will be matched. But if it's above $250, it won't be matched. Now, it's not just being matched, it's actually the match is being multiplied. So if I make a donation of $250, that's matched multiplied by 8. So instead of getting $250, a campaign would receive $2,000 on top of the $250, resulting in a contribution total of $2,250. Now, if you imagine that on an aggregate, that is really, really crazy, because suddenly you only need 1,500 donors and you're receiving $300,000 or more in terms of cash, which is just nuts. Now, this benefits Democrats because Democrats donors are more likely to be small dollar donors, and there are just more Democratic seats in New York State. This rule is made to benefit incumbents to an extent. So yes, Republicans do benefit in northern and western New York, but do you know where there are a lot more people and a lot more seats? Downstate New York. Places like Rockland, Westchester, New York City, and Long Island. That's really the meat of where all of this money is going to go, and where it is in fact going.
Wow. Okay, so somebody had to make the case to make this law in the first place. Where did that begin? Whose idea was it, in order to make this fair? Because, I mean, it sounds like on the one hand, some people have definitely figured out how to use it, but where did a great idea like this come from?
I actually don't know where it came from. I think it just came out of the machinery of the Democratic Party. But frankly, more likely than not, I think this was the idea of either the former governor or the current governor. At the end of the day, they lead their parties, and their parties don't act without them. That's where I think it came from. And also, their state party apparatus is the most likely to benefit from this, right? Under the new rule, there was kind of this rule change. Basically, for when you receive matching funds, right, you're supposed to return that money to the state public finance committee if you have any excess of funds. So if I receive $3,000, I spend $2,000, I have $1,000 left over, I have to return that $1,000 because that's a surplus. Under the new rule, the recent rule change, suddenly I can transfer that $1,000 to the state Democratic or Republican committee, and that will count as an expenditure, and I don't have to return that money.
Wow. So can something like this go on, though? And I think this is kind of the gist of what you're getting at, is they need to end this, but how does one go about doing this? Obviously, part of the system is going to say, no, this is working just fine. We don't need to fix anything.
I'm going to be straight up. Both parties do have an incentive to not let this go away, right? For Democrats, this is a way to finance their state, machinery to rebuild their infrastructure. We've seen multiple state senators, including James Skoufis, who is running for chair of the Democratic National Committee, transfer upwards of $400,000 to the state Democratic Committee so he doesn't have to return that money to the state Public Campaign Finance Committee. So there is incentive on the Democrats, but for the Republicans as well. I've spoken to some people in New York State politics, and they say this public matching program has made it easier to recruit candidates in districts we otherwise wouldn't be able to recruit people. So Republicans, to an extent, want to keep it. I just don't think Republicans are fully grasping that this is a major advantage to the Democratic Party. I actually think I should explain this a little more. The law doesn't just permit transferring money. It actually it sets limits, right? But those limits reset And what I mean is you have a primary, and if you're running for state senate, you can raise $375,000 for the primary from public matching funds, and you can't raise more. But then after the primary, it resets, and you can raise 375,000 more. But what's really interesting, though, is if you look at the law and you look at the applicable rules, if you're in a safe Democratic or Republican seat, more likely Democratic, because there's more Democrats and more Democratic seats, you can have a primary. And you can run unlimited amount of people in a primary. So if you run 5 people in a primary, and they all max out the contribution for state senate, they're all raising $375,000, and they all spend $100,000 campaigning. Let's say they have $250,000 left over. All the losers, the 4 losers, would have to return that money to the state. But under the new rule, they can just transfer all of their money to the state Democratic Committee. And guess what? That's $1 million going to the state Democratic Committee. And that's just in one seat for one specific race. Imagine if that's done on the aggregate.
I'm just marveling that this is being done in the open, right? It's not like they're not trying to hide it. I'm just thinking the chutzpah to do that.
Yeah, and that's what's stunning. But I think what's stunning is no one has really done this yet. I'm calling it a straw candidate scheme. We all know what a straw donor is, but what is a straw candidate? I call them as someone who isn't seriously running for office, but rather they're running to raise public matching funds. And I think that's what we're going to start seeing across the Empire State.
Yeah, I mean, well, they've provided all the right incentives, for people to do exactly that. So, what's the likelihood that this door is going to be slammed shut? Maybe?
I would say very unlikely until potentially if Democrats lose power. But even then, I don't know how much reform we get from Republicans, because I do think they, in their heads, they benefit. And to an extent, they do. They just don't benefit as much as Democrats benefit. So this is just peak machine politics 101.
Yeah. Do you see anything changing under the incoming Trump administration, or is New York still going to be New York doing as it does? And
I think New York is going to keep being New York, because while it would be my dream for the administration to end this, at the end of the day, the federal government only has control over federal campaign finance rules, and I'm talking about state finance rules here. And unfortunately, the federal government cannot affect those state finance rules, no matter how corrupt they may be.
Wow. Are there other states that are struggling with something very similar to this? Are you aware of any other states that likewise have allowed a similar system to come into being?
So I'm aware that other states do have public matching programs. States like Connecticut, for example, does have one, but it's not as corrupt as to the extent of New York's. New York's is just uniquely, grossly corrupt. Even politicians on both sides of the aisle that I've spoken to in states with matching programs, politicians and field organizers, they've all been shocked and appalled at just how, I guess, openly corrupt this is.
No, it sounds like it. And just when my faith in big government was starting to come back. Thanks a lot, Ryan. I really appreciate that. Actually,
thanks for having me.
We've been visiting with Ryan Silverstein. Ryan, for those who are following you on social media, what's the best place to find you and your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at RyRy916. You can follow me on LinkedIn, or you can follow me, LinkedIn and Twitter. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you so much.
And we are back, welcoming a new contributor to today's Moving Forward with Young Voices. And I may need a little bit of help once again with your name. It's Bojan Lazarevski.
Lazarevski.
There we go.
It's perfect.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And Bojan, for those who haven't met you yet, take a moment, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Brian. First of all, good afternoon, everyone listening to the podcast, and thank you for the invitation to be a guest speaker. I'm calling from North Macedonia in Europe. I'm a political scientist in international and intercultural studies, currently doing masters in political science in Skopje. I've been writing with Young Voices Europe for 7 months now, and I'm also an activist and researcher.
Well, I'm looking at an article you wrote about, I guess it's how voting takes place in the European Union. And your article's titled, "A Simple Change to Brussels Voting Can Unlock EU Soft Power Across the Globe." Talk to me about why is it cumbersome to build consensus and to get votes necessary to pass policy within the EU?
Yeah, so because we're talking to American audience before the podcast, I tried to find an example of the American political system which would help the audience understand better the significance of the veto in the EU system. So maybe it's not the best example, but there's the Senate filibuster in the United States, which is a tool allowing senators to block legislation by speaking for an extended period of time, or other tactics to prevent a vote from happening. So while it's not technically veto, I found like the best comparison with what's happening in the European Union. It effectively gives individual senators the power to stop laws from that the majority of senators would like to support. So in the EU, we have similar situation with the unanimity rule in the decision-making processes. So this means that every single EU member state must agree to a decision for it to pass in the policy areas where it's enforced. And if only one country disagrees, they can block the decision, even if most other countries are in favor. For example, on foreign policy or for sanctions, implementing sanctions for some country, a single country could stop action that the rest of the union wants to take. And this creates delays and can prevent urgent action on global issues, because sometimes we need to have fast decision, and much like how a filibuster can hold up important US legislation, even if most people support it. So, because compared to the United States, which is a federal state, European Union is like a supranational entity on its own with 27 sovereign independent countries that cooperate together. It has also a unique system of voting that's still evolving, and the veto has shown to be ineffective sometimes. So,
talk to me about qualified majority voting. I had not heard this term before reading your article. For those who aren't familiar with it, when we talk about qualified majority voting, what is it and how would it help the European Union in terms of streamlining decision making?
Yep. So I would like to note first that with each treaty in the formation of European Union in the past, the qualified majority voting has been added to more and more policy areas. First of all, the decisions were made by unanimity for everything, but then we started having the qualified majority voting. And in the current form of today, it effectively means that basically 55% majority of member states representing at least 65% of the population, so we have double majority, can enable progress without veto, which are paralyzing the decision making. So out of 27 member states, we need 55% of them to vote, and these countries should represent at the same time 65% of the population, because some countries are smaller. We have countries with less than 1 million population, and we have big countries like France or Germany that have almost 100 million population. So there's this double majority segment here that needs to take care of ensuring that also countries, but also the representation of the population will be respected. So it should ensure fair representation and support a balance of the interest of smaller countries, and also prevent larger countries from dominating the decisions only based on their population. The system guarantees that decision can be blocked by small countries either, because some countries can also do that. And in this way, in the current form, it's a fair, balanced approach to decision making that considers both sovereignty of countries, but also collective will. But of course, it's not really easy to enforce it in all policy areas, because no one wants to give up the veto power.
I'll admit, I really have not heard a lot about unanimous consent type of government being used. I like the idea of it, but it's clear that there are some shortcomings as evidenced by what you're addressing here in your article. It just seems like with unanimous consent, I think there's a lot of potential for good, but clearly there were some areas that the EU felt like this isn't moving quickly enough. Do they have the option if a particular nation doesn't go along with a particular policy? I mean, if the majority adopts it, are they bound then to uphold it?
In the current system, it's very difficult once a country vetoes a decision to change their mind. But we have some cases with Hungary and Poland blocking some decisions, and then Brussels trying to find some loopholes in the legislation to try to pass some internal laws in a different way. But that's not always easy, and it takes a lot of time. We have a few cases of the veto power that's being used. So, for example, in response to Russia-Ukraine, where the EU implemented sanction packages, but certain members like Hungary delayed or softened these measures. So maybe in these cases, we can say that the EU tried to put pressure by maybe upholding some funds for these countries or other tactics, but that's not always effective. We have deadlock in the EU enlargement, especially for North Macedonia, where first we had a problem and dispute with Greece that was vetoing the country, and now Bulgaria, the process of joining the European Union over historical and linguistic disputes, causing significant frustration among the aspiring members. So if EU wants to enlarge in the future with more member states, this can be a problem as in the Balkan region and Western Balkan, where most aspiring countries are located. There are a lot of these historical disputes that can result in more vetoes. And also we have in COVID delays in the recovery funds during the pandemic. It was also vetoed by Hungary and Poland. So they opposed the inclusion of some legislation related to that.
It's such a good breakdown. You point out too that the geopolitical landscape, especially right now in Europe, there are a lot of question marks. There are a lot of things that are developing and could be developing quickly. I can definitely see where the decision to streamline some of the decision making would come in handy. Just for you personally, is there anything that you're keeping a close eye on as 2025 begins? What's a top priority for you as far as what's happening in Europe?
Yeah, I think the European Union is lacking a strong leadership in this period, and some bold actions that will ensure that the EU remains a stable and credible actor in the geopolitical world, where we have increased polarization between other geopolitical actors. So we also have some internal instability right now, such as in France and Germany, and political economic crisis that's been going on for some time now. So it will be very important how to reform the European Union and how it's going to pass laws in the future. And in relation to in relation to the United States, we share a long history partnership on mutual support and shared values. So it's important to also have a reliable way of bringing decisions.
And we are back. Happy to welcome Aaron Pomerantz back to the program. Aaron has been on here a few times. And Aaron, for those who haven't yet heard from you, give us just a short introduction about who you are.
Hi, yeah, so I'm a social psychologist and researcher at Rice University here in now weirdly snowy Houston, Texas. And I study leadership, leader development, and the way culture can lead us to make decisions that harm ourselves and others, primarily in the domain of leadership.
Okay, well, good luck on the snow, by the way. That's that's not an everyday thing for Texas. So I'm looking at...
they can't drive in the sun, let alone the snow.
I won't laugh too hard. It's a tough time for everybody driving on slick roads. I'm looking at an article you wrote here for Real Clear Politics. DEI efforts must protect Jewish students or they're going to fail. It's, Aaron, I have this perception, and I could be wrong because it's just, based on some of the stories I've seen, but it appears that a lot of the nation's universities and schools are kind of dialing back their DEI efforts. What's your take on, is that the case?
I think it's a yes and no answer. I think that a lot of universities are going to be dialing them back if they were never really committed to them in the first place, number one, or if they were sold a version or a vision of DEI that made promises it's not delivering upon. So a lot of DEI programs, and it's important to clarify that DEI, it's kind of treated as a monolith, and I don't think that's fair. There is a lot of variety with what we talk about DEI. So like, for example, Ibram Kendi's views on DEI versus Mark Cuban's are almost entirely unrecognizable from each other, but both get given that label of DEI, right? So I think what you're seeing is some schools who either never really cared and they were doing this to be seen doing something, or because there were federal incentives for doing so or state incentives for doing so. Yeah, I think they're backing off. And I think you're seeing something similar to that in the corporate sphere as well. But I think you're also going to see that a lot of schools who did this because they were committed to it, they're going to stand strong. And I actually think in some ways that's a good thing, because if you're going to do a thing, you should do a thing because you believe it. And if you don't believe in it, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it. It doesn't matter who you hire. You're not going to do it effectively. This is a question of mission, vision, and values. So I think that's why we're seeing some schools dial it back. It's because they never really believed in it to begin with.
Let's talk about how this ties into anti-Semitism. I know we had a lot of protests going on, a little over a year ago on the nation's campuses. It was interesting to see how many of those protesters, what are you protesting? I don't know. I'm just, there's a protest and I'm a part of it. But what are the primary sources of I mean, it was very open anti-Semitism then. Has that calmed down? Is it still going on, just not getting the media attention that it was before?
I think it's still going on. I think it's becoming a little more subtle, and I think we're going to see that trend increase, especially now that President Trump has been inaugurated, and one of the things he is championing is deporting people who sympathize with terrorists, which a lot of these protests were doing. If you're waving a Houthi flag, that's what you're doing. But I think it's going to get more subtle to avoid negative press. And that's what we're kind of seeing. We're seeing, so last week when I wrote the piece, this was last week then, so it's probably about a month and a half ago now, a DEI administrator, she had been saying at University of Michigan, she'd been saying behind closed doors, essentially, that, we don't need to take care of Jews. They're wealthy and privileged, and they take care of themselves. There have also been numerous diversity, equity, and inclusion, and however you want to rearrange those words, there have been numerous DEI conferences that have seen really horrific instances of anti-Semitism, some to the point that people like Jewish attendees are hiding their Stars of David. There was one that was held in I believe at Villanova. It was in the Philly area, where a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, I don't remember which, she openly just started essentially repeating blood libels, like 100-year-old blood libels. She may as well have just flipped open and read from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is a woman who's supposed to be talking about safety and inclusion, which are both core values to DEI. They're without those, what the heck is the point, right? And yet this is what's going on. So I think we're going to see a subtler vision of it, and that's actually what I read about in the piece, is that this is something we've seen before, and that subtler version of prejudice is actually one of the reason, not the only reason, but one of the reasons DEI programs were created to begin with, was to acknowledge that, you don't have to say I hate you to communicate the fact that you hate somebody. I think we've all had a bully who was very good at doing that to us in elementary or middle school, and that just holds true for the rest of life, including racism.
Boy, there's a lot to chew on there. First of all, I appreciate you doing this, because I'll admit, when I see DEI, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but my knee-jerk reaction is, that stuff again. basically, I've kind of trained myself to see it in a negative light, like it's reverse discrimination, that kind of thing. It's very helpful to hear some of the things that you're talking about here today. Philosophically, I want to say, I don't think, like you mentioned the tenet of DEI about symbolic racism. I question whether that stuff helps, because it seems like sometimes that can be used to create more conflict or division where there wasn't. But again, let's bring it back to for these students on campus who are afraid of being recognized as Jewish. Tell me again how DEI helps them.
Well, in theory, what DEI should be doing is, whether there's a DEI office or whether it's held under the Title IX office or whether it's a part of human resources, whatever it is, if there's a DEI initiative, people who are anti-Semitic should be called to the carpet. That doesn't mean they're necessarily punished, the individual who's doing this, especially because, given how insidious racism and can be, including anti-Semitism, sometimes people do things that they don't realize. And I think those people don't deserve to have the book thrown at them if they are genuinely willing to learn. I think that's really important. But it's the DEI initiative, whether, again, that's an office or what have you, it's their job to do that. And now what we're seeing is that DEI offices are just refusing to engage with the topic or understand what it is that's happening here. They'll do things like repeat blatantly false statements like, "Oh, Judaism is just a religion. It's Jews are just Polish and German people who converted to this. You're not an ethnicity, and that's not a protected class," which is like, that's a Title VI suit ready to happen. So it's just bad for the school that they're doing that. But it is also really bad for the students, because these students are supposed to be feeling safe, like they belong on campus. Not to the point that they can't face hard or harsh ideas, but I think we'd all agree there's a difference between facing hard ideas and difficult ideas and wrestling with them, and being told, Hitler should have finished the rest of you off, seeing Nazi salutes being given at rallies, or Kaibar Kaibar Ya Yahud, or any other Arabic slogan that's just one variety of "kill the Jews." These are not difficult ideas. That's just threats and racism. And it's the DEI initiative's job to deal with that, and they're not doing that. And if they're not doing that, then it's no wonder people's gut reaction is going to be, "Ugh, this is a waste of time, and it's divisive, and it's hypocritical," because, that's what they're seeing. And we aren't owed the constant benefit of the doubt if we're screwing up these initiatives and doing this stuff.
It sure seemed like the campus administrations were very, very quick to bend over backward to accommodate the protesters who were out there, shouting the anti-Semitic slogans. It's like, I don't know if they just flat feared them or didn't want to make a scene. A little too late for that, but it seems like they had no stomach whatsoever to draw the line and say this is inappropriate for this campus.
Yeah, and I think that's mostly true in terms of the cases we can all think of, things like Columbia, for example. But I think there have actually been a number of cases as well, and I won't name names, but there have been some really good cases in higher ed as well, where it was the DEI office or somebody dedicated to a DEI initiative, like a president or a chancellor, who would do things and say things like, "Okay, you have a right to free speech. You don't have a right to anti-Semitism. Here is a very hard line in the sand, and if you cross it, there will be consequences." And I think we need more of that.
Again, we are talking with Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. Aaron, where do people find you and your work online?
You can find me on Twitter at pompom9211, and you can find me on the Young Voices website.
And we are back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. Happy to welcome Alex Rosado back to the program. Alex, you're getting to be the old pro on here, but take a moment to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, so thank you so much for having me back. I'm Alex Rosado. I am a professional programs assistant at the Alexander Hamilton Society. And as a side note, this is a nonpartisan nonprofit, so everything that I say is expressive of my own views.
All right. So I understand there was a little bit of a hubbub in Washington, D.C. yesterday.
There always is a hubbub, but the hubbub that happened yesterday was a big one. Donald Trump is back in office for his second term, and he's going to have a lot of strong foreign policy that comes with it as well. You've already seen it when he wasn't even president, when he was still the president-elect. A lot of the hostages that are within Israel and Gaza have been released. Israel just released 3 more. Palestine just released about 90, I believe. And you're seeing now that even with Ukraine and Russia, a lot of the attrition that's coming from both sides is slowly coming to an end. So you're seeing that there is a return to power with the Trump administration, and the world is becoming a lot more stable as a result.
Let's talk a little bit about there are different ways he could go in terms of his foreign policy, but there's a particular type of foreign policy restraint that you pointed out, and I have to admit, I never heard of George Ball, or at least I would not have known to what to put his name, but he apparently set quite the example on how to approach foreign policy.
He is one of the modern architects of restraint with foreign policy. And for those who may not know who he is, he was the former Undersecretary of State during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and was one of the major and key players of advocating for not invading the country of Vietnam that happened during the 60s and most of the 70s as well. Most people didn't listen to his advice. Even President Johnson scoffed at one point, saying that his advice really was intangible and there was no way that we couldn't put boots on the ground. But as you saw the domestic backlash with that, with draft burning cards and mass protests, Ball was right. It did sink us into an unwinnable war, and that's exactly what happened.
So in terms of the biggest changes that are likely to happen in foreign policy, is it safe to say, is Ukraine going to be the first most noticeable shift under a Trump administration?
It very well may be, and that comes with a lot of evaluation of the practical and ethical concerns of the war as well. You've had Volodymyr Zelensky, the person who's running Ukraine, saying that this is a war about protecting democracy, and the amount of aid that the United States has given Ukraine, about $185 billion worth, is not about funding war, but about democracy itself. But George Ball has a warning against that. He says, let's not shift things and view things just along ideological lines. Everything is not as black and white as it seems. There's a lot of different struggles when it comes to historical contexts, when it comes to land disputes.
I still can't believe I have never heard of this guy, or at least haven't heard, of him. I probably have encountered his name once in a history book and then forgot it.
No, absolutely. And you just need a holistic understanding of how war operates, the amount of resources that you're willing to dedicate towards it, and just have a more informative approach instead of just going gung-ho with military force.
So I'm curious. It seemed like there was a great effort to get the U.S. further and further entangled as NATO, in what was going on in Ukraine. I'm wondering, Alex, does that are we moving back from that escalation mindset? The long range missiles into Russia and so forth. What's your take on that?
Sure. So we would be leveraging other forms of soft aid, whether it be humanitarian efforts. The Biden administration tried to do that with one of the piers that was built within Gaza, but that lasted for 2 weeks, cost taxpayers actually billions of dollars, only for that to just collapse. And especially during what you saw with the last 4 years with the Biden administration, you saw that a lot of these kind of melting pot conflicts that were happening just really boil over, and it didn't give the world more stability or better progress because of it. The most notable being Afghanistan, that happened with 13 U.S. dead service members, and especially with what Ball was warning about back in the 60s and 70s. You saw a lot of similarities between the toppling of Afghanistan and also what happened with Saigon, including very similar pictures of helicopters lifting off abandoned air bases in a sign of defeat. So foreign restraint in terms of foreign policy isn't just giving up and going home. It's making sure that the conflicts that you're going to potentially be a part of are ones that you know that you can win and one that you can be the victor in as well.
Given the U.S. presence all over the world, and particularly throughout the Middle East, is it possible to still have strength abroad without permanent bases everywhere? I'm just curious.
Absolutely. Yes, I would consider so. And just with the U.S. foreign policy, there are many different ways to do it. George Ball advocated for diplomacy, and this was even something that the Kennedy administration did too, having culture play a big part in allowing countries to experience what other cultures are like as well. Kennedy did this with, for some reason, jazz ambassadors, having Duke Ellington go around the Middle East, like in Egypt, and playing. So there are different ways to engage with foreign entanglements, and not all of them have to be military related. Military has to be a last use resort. Force of power can come from either coercion or through compromise. And it really is up to the U.S. on a case-by-case basis to determine that. And I think that George Ball demonstrates that very well with his advice and his wisdom that we should listen to.
I love it. I love it. In terms of the spending, I'm just curious if Ball had any take on the immense amount of money that's spent. I'm specifically thinking of what's been sent to Ukraine versus the needs of people in Western North Carolina, who were lost their homes and their property in the flooding. It just seems like there's one could make the case that it's a lot easier to spend other people's money on wars and faraway things than it is to take care of things closer to home.
Certainly, if you're going to be proactive and build a more peaceful, organic, and conservative world order, you have to ask those difficult questions about how you value life and abstract ideas, and how America can really have long-term sustainability over short-term engagement. Ball tells us that we have to have resource stewardship, and that comes with taking care of America as well as taking care of some of our allies abroad. When it comes to what happened with the Maui wildfires back in 2023, hurricane ravaged North Carolina last year, and now what you're seeing with California wildfires, citizens are getting about $700-800 stipends one time, and that's it. Meanwhile, as I alluded to beforehand, $185 billion being sent to Ukraine. It really shows preference within the government spending policy, but you need a limited government that will take care of the U.S. citizens, and then hopefully those effects will proliferate abroad and bring ensuring peace for all of those people who will follow.
Alex, I sure appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. And, here's to a little optimism that we're moving in a better direction from this point forward. For people who want to follow you and either on social media or follow your writing, where's the best place to do that?
You can follow me on Twitter/X at Alex P. Rosado.
Okay. Alex, great to catch up with you. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you for having me.